So thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks for Molly and Una as well for inviting me to speak today. So I'm just going to talk to you about a small part of a project that we were doing with diabetes clinic nurse specialists across the country. So I want to kind of start by outlining what are the core components of integrated knowledge translation, which I really kind of started looking into before this presentation, just to kind of see, did we really kind of fit in with this kind of work, what we were doing, and how much we aligned with those core components. So I'll come back to these at the end again to just kind of reflect on maybe how that project fits in with these three components, which are to co-produce knowledge, to develop an ongoing relationship between decision makers and researchers, and to generate some mutually beneficial research. So just by way of a little bit of background, so the National Clinical Programme for Diabetes was established in 2010 with the aim of improving the quality of care. That was the overarching aim, and there was two components really to that programme. The first being to develop a national model of integrated care, and then to recruit new integrated diabetes nurse specialists to facilitate that model. And the role of these nurses really is to spend most of their time in the community, supporting primary care in the management of type 2 diabetes, and to spend some of their time then interacting and working with the multidisciplinary team in the hospital. So really, these new posts came on board, and they started collecting data on their activity, really a ground-up process that was kind of started by the nurses themselves through this network that they're part of, the Primary Care Diabetes Nurse Network. So they really wanted to do this just to be able to look at how the role was being implemented, to establish some sort of benchmark for the activity that they were doing and their role, and then to be able to demonstrate whether it was feasible to collect this data and could they do that as part of their clinical workflow. So where we came in then, so the research group that I work with is free. So Molly mentioned at the start the Research Leader Funding Award, and my PI, Patricia Kearney, is also funded under that stream. And as part of that, there's already a link there with the national programme. So Patricia Kearney would have sat on the national working group for that programme. And we were already doing some work evaluating the national programme. We wanted to look at some data, whatever data we could, on how that new nurse specialist role was being delivered. So with that in mind, we approached the nursing group and asked them, could we use this data that they were collecting anyway? And they were very happy to do that. So we kind of sat down with them and started looking at what they were collecting. And I suppose this is where the kind of partnership started, in the sense that the data they were collecting, they were using Excel. It was just kind of supposed to be a kind of an easy enough process they could do as part of their ongoing role. But they felt, and we noticed as well, that there were some problems with how the data was being collected. Some kind of practical things, just like different levels of detail, missing data, some of the definitions of the different variables that they were collecting were a little unclear to the nurses. And really what we were asking, what the nurses are asking the same question is, are these indicators reflecting what they should be? Are they collecting the data that really reflects the role? So based on that then, we felt that it made sense for us to kind of work together to improve these indicators, both for ourselves to be able to use that data, and then for the nurses to be able to use it as well in their own work. So I looked at the scoping review that was recently done on integrated knowledge translation, and they suggest a number of different ways and strategies that you can work with decision makers. So we primarily worked with the nurses through meetings, so presenting at the national meetings of the Primary Care Network I spoke of. They meet kind of a couple of times a year, so that's our main interaction with the nursing group. And we also interacted with Niamh Smith, who's the National Clinical Programme Manager, and Helen Twomley, who'd been the clinical nursing lead for that, for the Integrated Nurse Network. So we felt that the way we were going to improve the indicators was through a process of us auditing the data, giving feedback to the nurses, and then kind of working together to kind of see how we could improve that. So we had a good basis for using audit and feedback. So this review by Ivers and colleagues has shown that it does lead to improvements and changes in professional practices. It's also something that's been used specifically in relation to knowledge translation. So this ongoing study by Hutchinson is underway to promote education or medication error reporting using audit and feedback. So as I said, our main aim was to kind of refine and improve these indicators and develop them so they'd be more useful going forward. So again, the scoping review kind of recommends kind of mapping out where the different respective, the respective parties, the decision makers, in this case the nursing group, and ourselves, where we sit in terms of the process. So really, when I looked at this, then I felt that we were involved at all the different stages. So we came up with a plan for how we were going to do this and how this is going to work. The nurses obviously were collecting the data. We both would have worked to interpret the findings, interpret the data, and that would have been, again, as I said, myself and Sheena McHugh, who's working on this project. We were working with Helen and Neve to really interpret the findings, so we were working closely in that element as well. And then in terms of implementing the changes, again, it would have been ourselves working closely with the nurses. So I felt really we were kind of involved at all stages of the knowledge translation process here. So as I said, we started kind of formally kind of saying we were going to work together on this when we saw challenges with the data and how it was being collected. It took place over 2 years. We had a number of points where we kind of interacted with the nursing group, primarily through these national presentations to the wider network. And at each stage, we would have refined the indicators, revised them, and then kind of gone back, looked at the data again, and presented them, what our feedback was on the data at each stage. So there was also 2 occasions as well where we got feedback on the feedback. So the feedback that we were giving them, we really wanted to see like what we were telling them, was it making sense to them, the whole process. So we did that in September 2016, and then most recently in April and May this year, just with the annual report that we produced on the data, we kind of fed that back to the nurses and got their feedback on that as well. So I'm just going to talk about 2 of those points first. So the September meeting, so what we did was go in and present the activity data, basically the patterns in the data, so they could have a look at where their activity was in relation to other nurses in the network. And then as we were going through that, we were also flagging up issues that we'd found with the data and kind of basically put it to the floor to the nurses in terms of how they thought that could be improved, or why say certain information was more difficult to collect, why it was missing, is there any indicators they felt should be collected to better reflect the role. And so the survey then that we asked them after that presentation was really just to say that did it make sense while we were presenting them, was it useful? Did they feel the data was comprehensive enough as it was? And what way did they want to get this feedback? How did they want this process to work going forward? Did they want to continue with presentations, or did they want something else? So the nurses that were attending the meeting, so the main kind of outcome that they all agree that basically there was other indicators that should be collected as part of the activity, mainly around patient education, professional education. So they wanted to have some indicator that would reflect the work they were doing there, and also to capture the work that they do through phone consultations. So the indicators had already captured, the number of patients they see, the type of patients they see, and the practices they attend, and things like that, but they hadn't necessarily captured that element of the work. Some of the open comments then from the survey were really that they found the presentations useful, but really they wanted kind of more time to be able to reflect on that data and where they sit relative to the wider group. And finally as well, in terms of receiving feedback from our side of the process, they wanted to be able to, they liked having a presentation, but also they wanted it in a report as well. So we kind of used that information then to decide what would be the next form that feedback would take. The most recent, I suppose, the point we've been working up to now is kind of developing an annual report of the data, and most recently I would have presented that to the nurses in April and May, just to see their feedback on that. So really that was kind of, again, a kind of an open forum kind of format where, you kind of gave them an overview of the annual report and then asked them for any feedback on that and the recommendations. So I would have met with the national group and then also with the Munster group as well. So in this meeting, they kind of went through the report in detail with me. Again, they kind of flagged up that further data needs to be collected to ensure the role is reflected. Some of the indicators, there was still a little lack of clarity around what the indicators meant and what they should be collecting for specific variables. So the phone consultations was one thing that didn't necessarily work because not everybody was collecting this routinely. And I'll come back to that maybe at the end in just terms of what I thought were the issues with that process. But then all the nurses kind of agreed that basically that this process was feasible, which is one of the things they wanted to demonstrate at the start, which was that this is something they can do as part of their workflow. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of reflecting on the whole process. I've called these barriers, but really they are more reflections because they didn't in any way stall the process or stop it kind of continuing, and we've kind of continued to have that relationship with the nursing group. One thing that's probably come up with the other presentations as well is just kind of being able to be aware of the different needs and priorities that people want from, I should say actually before I go through this, that again these barriers are from the scoping review. So when I was reflecting on the barriers, I kind of looked at that review and kind of felt that most of what I was reflecting on really kind of fitted what they found as well. So that's why I've kind of pulled out the ones I think relate to our own project. But basically, we started off the project, I suppose we kind of jumped into it because it made sense. It made sense for us to work together to improve these indicators. But then as kind of project progressed, it became apparent that we maybe had different goals or different priorities from what we were aiming to get out of this data and out of improving this data. So we wanted it to be able to look at the implementation of the role, and the nursing network were interested in this too, but also they wanted to be able to use it to really demonstrate the value of their role, to be able to use it as a business case going forward for further positions, and also to have to put in place to make a bid for a clinical lead integrated nurse who would kind of advocate for these roles and standardise them. So really, I suppose at the start, this wasn't like, we didn't necessarily kind of spend a lot of time fleshing out what the different goals from this work was. It kind of became more apparent towards the end, and I think that's probably something would have been useful to kind of figure out at the start. The other main issue is the lack of funding and infrastructure for this project. So we were kind of just doing it because it made sense, and we were already working with the nurses, so I would have done another project with diabetes nurse specialist part of my PhD. So it made sense to kind of fill in here and work with them on the data, but there was no dedicated funding, and obviously there's always a risk with research staff, the contracts and turnover that, had I kind of moved on to a new position or had I not been staying with the school beyond the PhD, does this work continue, and who is going to actually be the researcher on the other side of that relationship? So that's something that we're kind of trying to figure out as well, like how far this relationship goes or how long the work continues. So on one hand, that point about staff turnover relates to the research staff, but it also relates to the nurses. So one thing I found as well is that I mentioned before that, when I came back to the nurses, the definitions around what they were supposed to be collecting was not always clear, and that's something that continued throughout the project. But part of the reason that was the case is because the cohort of nurses at the start of the project, there was obviously more posts coming on board as we went along. So those new nurses were just finding their feet with the position, finding their feet with collecting the activity data. So then they were coming kind of back to the step where they weren't sure exactly what these definitions were, what they were supposed to be doing with this data. So that's really, it's kind of more reflective of just the way things work, that you're just trying to get everybody up to speed with the project as new people come on board. There's also the issue of the fact that we're mostly mediating our contacts through the national meetings. And so nurses don't, they wouldn't always have the time to attend every meeting, so it wouldn't necessarily be the same nurses attending every presentation. So then you're kind of ending, but you're not really relating to the same cohort every time. It's a different group of nurses, slightly different group of nurses every time at every meeting. So it's kind of hard to keep that kind of momentum going of improvement when there's different stakeholders coming in and out of the process. And finally, as well, kind of what you'd expect. I mean, this isn't their priority. They're collecting the data as a kind of an aside to their clinical role, and nor should it be a priority. And I think that's challenging, just to kind of have them make the time to improve the data as part of their normal role. And so that's just in terms of the annual report. I won't go into that. But so I kind of want to finish again just by bringing in some enablers, because really this was kind of a positive process. So one thing to say is that we really benefit from the leadership that we had from Niamh Smith, who was the programme manager, and then Helen, who would have been the lead for the nursing group. So I think a part of these relationships is you kind of spend quite a lot of time trying to establish trust. We didn't necessarily have to do that because we had Helen and we had Niamh, who were really these boundary spanners or those champions for us, that they went in and kind of said, okay, these are the researchers that are going to help us to improve our activity data, we're going to work together, and there was never any kind of question there about what are we doing here, or why is this partnership being set up. And again, although I mentioned about the nurses maybe not always turning up to the same meetings, and there's kind of, that kind of turnover, when they were there, they were always very much there, they were very engaged, and they were very open and willing to take on board our suggestions and to work with us to improve the data. And again, as I mentioned at the start, we were working on a pre-existing relationship that we already had with the national programme. So I'm just going to finish by coming back to the core components that I mentioned at the start. So I feel we did co-produce knowledge over the course of this relationship. We did improve the indicators, and we added in new indicators that both ourselves and the nurses felt would better reflect the role. We established an ongoing relationship, which is still ongoing as well. And we also, I suppose we both got benefits from this process. We improved the quality of the data, which is beneficial for us and for our evaluation project. The nurses have a better quality data set that they can use then for leverage for their posts and to really reflect what they're doing on the ground, the volume of work that they are doing. And for myself, as well as a researcher, I found it really useful to work with Helen and even to work with the nurses in terms of, it just gave me a better understanding of how to pitch this information to a different group, to different stakeholders, which is something you don't necessarily pick up when you're working in academia the whole time. So the two outstanding questions, I suppose, or the two outstanding points that I just want to finish with was that, first of all, we're still not sure about how sustainable this process is. At the moment, we're still not sure if we can continue this, or the annual report is kind of where we just leave it go and just kind of say that's as far as we go with this process and improving those indicators. But the second thing is that this has really been a useful project, not just for the project itself, but for establishing a relationship that we can now use as a platform for other projects. So we're working with the nursing group in supporting them in delivering a patient experience survey of their service. So we've been able to kind of step in there and say we can offer support for that project. So even if you're not sure where the project ends or whether you've achieved what you set out to achieve, you're always gaining something as a researcher, and I just kind of wanted to finish on that point. So I'd just like to thank my PI and Sheena McHugh as well, who's involved in this process, and Helen and Neve. So thank you.
Lovely, thanks very much, Fiona. We might move on to our fourth presentation. So Saoirse